The cerulean light of twin moons cast long shadows across the jagged landscape as Jonas tracked his prey through the underbrush. Six-legged and vicious, the azure wolf had wandered too close to his territory. His stomach had been empty for 2 days now. He couldn't afford to lose this one. Jonas moved with practiced silence, his weathered body responding to each subtle shift in the terrain. The leather of his handmade boots made no sound against the rocky soil. His breath came slow and measured despite the exertion. He'd been hunting these creatures since he was 12 summers old. Now, with 38 behind him, he could track them in his sleep. The crosswind carried his scent away from the beast as it paused to drink from a small pool of collected rainwater. Jonas nocked an arrow, the familiar tension of the bowstring a comfort in this harsh world. His fingers, calloused and strong, drew back with perfect control. For a moment he held completely still. The wolf's head jerked up suddenly, ears twitching. It had sensed something, but it was too late. Jonas released the arrow, and it struck true, piercing the creature's heart. A quick, clean kill. He allowed himself a rare smile as he approached the fallen beast. Meat for a week, if he dried it properly. Hide for patches on his worn cloak. Tendons for bowstrings. Nothing wasted, nothing taken without purpose. This was the way he had survived when all other humans on this unforgiving world had perished. As he knelt beside his kill, the bushes to his left rustled violently. Jonas spun, drawing his knife in one fluid motion. Another wolf, larger than the first, burst from the undergrowth, its 6 legs propelling it forward with terrifying speed. A mate responding to the death cry of its partner. Jonas had no time to reach for his bow. He dropped into a defensive crouch, knife extended. The wolf launched itself at him, jaws open to reveal rows of needle-sharp teeth. He pivoted at the last second, driving the blade deep into the creature's flank as its momentum carried it past him. The wounded wolf howled, a sound that echoed across the barren landscape. It turned for another attack, favoring its injured side. Blood matted its blue fur, but the wound wasn't mortal. Jonas knew he had seconds before it charged again. He lunged for his spear, which leaned against a nearby rock. His fingers closed around the shaft just as the wolf sprang. He braced the butt of the spear against the ground, angling the point upward. The beast's own weight drove the spear through its chest as it crashed into Jonas, knocking him backward. They fell together, man and beast, in a tangle of limbs and fur. The wolf thrashed in its death throes, one sharp claw catching Jonas's arm and opening a long gash. He gritted his teeth against the pain, holding the dying animal down until it finally went still. Jonas pushed the heavy carcass off him, breathing hard. 2 kills instead of 1, a fortunate turn despite the injury. He examined his arm. The cut was deep but clean. He'd had worse. From a pouch at his belt, he took a handful of dried moss, one of the few earth plants that had adapted to this world, and pressed it against the wound. The moss would slow the bleeding until he could properly clean and bind the injury. As he worked, a foreign scent caught his attention. Smoke. Not the natural smoke of lightning-struck trees, but the controlled burn of campfires. People. The nomadic tribes rarely ventured this far into the Badlands. Something was wrong. Leaving the wolves where they fell, he would return for them. Jonas moved toward the source of the smoke, his hunter's instincts on high alert. He kept to the shadows, bow ready, eyes scanning constantly for movement. The familiar weight of his hunting knife pressed against his thigh, reassuring in its presence. Over the ridge, in a small canyon protected from the worst of the winds, lay a camp, or what remained of one. Jonas counted 6 tents, all bearing the distinctive purple markings of the Dravari, slavers who roamed the eastern territories. They were feared even among their own kind for their cruelty. But something had visited cruelty upon them first. Bodies lay scattered across the campsite, their blue skin mottled with the telltale purple blotches of the wasting sickness. Jonas had seen it before, sweeping through human settlements in his childhood. It was the disease that had claimed his parents, his sister, and eventually everyone else, leaving him alone in a world never meant for his kind. He approached cautiously, holding a scrap of cloth over his nose and mouth. The sickness couldn't survive long without a host, but he wouldn't take unnecessary risks. The camp had been abandoned for at least 2 days, judging by the state of the bodies. One of the dead Dravari clutched a weapon Jonas had never seen before. A bow made from some kind of bone, strung with what looked like metallic wire. He examined it carefully. The design was strange but effective, offering greater tension than his own wooden bow. After a moment's hesitation, he took it, along with a quiver of arrows tipped with serrated metal points. The Dravari had no use for them now. As Jonas moved between the tents, checking for anything useful, medicine, weapons, tools, a sound stopped him cold. A whimper barely audible coming from the center of the camp. There, tied to a wooden post, was a child. A small, frail thing with skin the color of pale twilight. An Adari child, one of the peaceful nomadic tribes that wandered the great desert to the south. Her wrists were raw from the bindings, and her small body trembled with fever. Jonas hesitated. He had avoided all contact with the native species for years, content in his solitude. Their problems were not his. Survival was hard enough alone, let alone burdened with a sick child who would likely die anyway. But as he turned to leave, the child's eyes opened, deep violet irises, bright with fever, fixed on him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. She made a small sound, not quite a word, reaching one bound hand toward him. "Damn it all," Jonas muttered, the sound of his own voice strange in his ears after so many months of silence. With a few quick strides, he crossed to the post and cut the child free with his hunting knife. She collapsed against him, burning with fever. The purple marks of the wasting sickness were beginning to show on her neck. Without treatment, she would be dead within days. Jonas knew he should leave her. It was the sensible thing to do. But as he held her small form, he remembered another child, long ago himself, watching helplessly as the sickness took everyone he loved. "Not this time," he whispered, gathering her into his arms. Before he could leave the camp, a low growl froze him in place. From behind one of the fallen tents emerged a massive predator, a sand cat, its pale hide almost white in the moonlight, nearly twice the size of an earth tiger, with 4 eyes and jaws that could crush bone. It must have been drawn by the scent of death. Jonas stood perfectly still, the child cradled against his chest. The sand cat's 4 eyes fixed on him, assessing. It was a hunter like him, and it recognized another predator when it saw one. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the camp. Then, with deliberate slowness, Jonas reached for the bone bow he'd taken from the dead Dravari. The sand cat tensed, a rumble building in its throat. In a single fluid motion, Jonas knocked an arrow and fired. The metal-tipped projectile struck the sand cat's shoulder. Not a killing blow, but enough to make it yowl in pain and surprise. It backed away, confused by this prey that bit back from a distance. Jonas used the moment to retreat, keeping his eyes on the wounded predator. The sand cat paced back and forth, torn between hunger and the instinct for self-preservation. Finally, with a last threatening growl, it turned and vanished into the night. The journey back to his cave took twice as long, burdened as he was with the child. By the time he arrived, the smaller moon had set, and the larger one hung low in the sky. The child's breathing had grown labored, her skin hot to the touch. Jonas laid her on his sleeping pallet of furs and went to work. From a leather pouch hanging on the cave wall, he extracted dried leaves of the silver fern that grew near the thermal springs to the west. His mother, the expedition's botanist, had discovered its medicinal properties before the sickness took her. Her knowledge, passed to him, had saved him when he contracted a milder strain of the disease as a boy. He crushed the leaves with a stone mortar, adding water from his collection basin to form a paste. As he worked, the child watched him through half-lidded eyes, her body tense with fear despite her weakness. "I won't hurt you," Jonas said, his voice rough from disuse. "This will help the fever." She didn't understand his words, of course. The Adari language was musical and complex, nothing like the practical English his people had spoken. But perhaps his tone conveyed enough, for she didn't struggle when he approached with the paste. Jonas applied the mixture to her forehead, neck, and the soles of her feet, just as his mother had done for him. Then he tilted her head up gently, offering a small cup of water mixed with the liquid extract of the fern. "Drink," he said, miming the action. After a moment's hesitation, she did, grimacing at the bitter taste but swallowing it all. With nothing more to be done, Jonas retrieved his bow and headed back out into the night. He still had 2 wolves to bring home, and now he had 2 mouths to feed. When he returned with the butchered meat of the wolves, the child was sleeping fitfully, her small body shivering despite the fur covering. Jonas built up the fire, then set about preparing the meat for drying. As he worked, he found himself glancing frequently at the sleeping child, half expecting her to have slipped away. But her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, fighting the sickness that had claimed so many. By morning, her fever had spiked dangerously high. Jonas renewed the paste application, adding a rare root he had been saving for emergencies. The child no longer responded to his touch, lost in the delirium of high fever. "Stay with me," he murmured, wiping her forehead with a damp cloth. "Fight it." Throughout that day and the next, Jonas barely slept, constantly monitoring the child's condition. He made broth from the wolf meat, spooning tiny amounts between her cracked lips whenever she surfaced briefly from unconsciousness. He changed the medicinal paste regularly, mashed more roots, and gathered fresh water from the stream that ran near his cave. On the third night, as the larger moon reached its zenith, the child's fever broke in a sudden rush of sweat that soaked through the furs. Her breathing eased, and for the first time she fell into a natural healing sleep. Jonas sank back against the cave wall, exhaustion crashing over him like a wave. He had done what he could, now it was up to her. With that thought, he allowed himself to sleep, knife still in hand, a habit of survival that even exhaustion couldn't override. He woke to the sensation of being watched. The child was sitting up, regarding him with curious violet eyes no longer clouded by fever. She said something in her language, a question by the sound of it. "I don't understand," Jonas said, reaching for the water skin, "but you should drink." She accepted the water cautiously, taking small sips. Her gaze never left him, assessing this strange being who had saved her. "Jonas," he said, pointing to himself. It felt odd, introducing himself after so many years of speaking to no one. The child tilted her head, then pointed to herself. "Ishara," she said. Jonas nodded. "Ishara." The name was too complex for his human tongue. "Leah, Usso," he said instead, shortening it to something he could pronounce. She frowned, then repeated, "Leah," testing the sound. After a moment, she nodded acceptance of the new name. 3 days passed in a blur of tending to the child, hunting for food, and gathering more medicinal plants. The fever broke on the second night, but weakness kept her bedridden. Jonas found himself talking more than he had in years, not caring that she couldn't understand him. The sound of another voice, even his own, filled the empty spaces of his solitude. "The expedition arrived 97 years ago," he told her as he prepared a broth from the last of the wolf meat. 150 colonists, including my grandparents. They thought this world could be terraformed. He laughed, a harsh sound. They were wrong. The atmosphere was compatible enough for survival, but the soil wouldn't take earth crops. And then the wasting came. The child watched him with curious eyes, her color improving by the hour. She had begun to respond to the name Leah. Not her real name, surely, but something he could call her. "I was 10 when my parents died," he continued, offering her a wooden bowl of broth. 17 when the last of the colony succumbed. I've been alone since then." He looked at her small hands as they wrapped around the bowl. "Until now." On the 4th day, Leah tried to stand. Her legs wobbled beneath her, but her determination was evident in the set of her jaw. Jonas watched from the cave entrance, where he was skinning a rabbit-like creature with emerald fur. "Careful," he said as she took a tentative step. "You're still weak." She looked at him, head tilted in that curious way of hers, and said something in her own language. The melodic syllables echoed in the cave. Jonas shook his head. "I don't understand." Leah frowned, then pointed to herself. "Leah," she said, mimicking the name he'd given her. Then she pointed to him, eyebrows raised in question. "Jonas," he replied, touching his chest. "Jonas," she repeated carefully, the name sounding strange with her accent. It was a start. By the end of the week, Leah was strong enough to venture outside the cave. Jonas watched her closely as she explored the immediate surroundings, ready to snatch her back if danger appeared. The Badlands were no place for the unwary. On the 8th day, as they were returning from checking snares Jonas had set in the nearby valley, a distant roar echoed across the Badlands. Leah froze, her small hand finding Jonas's. "What that?" she asked in her broken English. a language he was learning with surprising speed. Jonas scanned the horizon, his experienced eyes picking out movement among the distant rock formations. Sandcat, he said grimly. Big predator, very dangerous. It was the same one from the Dravari camp, he was certain. The distinctive white coat was visible even at this distance, and it was hunting them. Back to cave, Jonas said urgently, taking Leah's hand. Stay close. They moved quickly but carefully, taking advantage of the rocky terrain to break their trail. The Sandcat was faster in open ground, but here in the Badlands, Jonas's knowledge of the territory gave them an edge. As they rounded a large boulder, Jonas spotted a narrow crevice in the rock face, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, but too small for the Sandcat to follow. He pushed Leah toward it. In there, he ordered. Go deep. She hesitated only a moment before complying, her slender body slipping easily into the narrow space. Jonas followed, his broader shoulders scraping against the rock walls. The crevice opened into a small cavern, dim but not completely dark thanks to a crack in the ceiling that admitted a shaft of sunlight. Outside, they heard the Sandcat arrive, its heavy paws sending small cascades of pebbles down the rock face. A frustrated growl echoed through the crevice as the predator caught their scent but couldn't reach them. Will it wait? Leah whispered, pressing close to Jonas. Maybe, he replied honestly. They're patient hunters. For hours, they sat in the cramped cavern, listening to the occasional sounds of the Sandcat circling their hiding place. Jonas used the time to teach Leah more words, pointing to parts of his body and naming them, then asking her to repeat. She was a quick study, eager to communicate. As the light through the ceiling crack dimmed with the setting sun, the sounds outside finally ceased. Jonas waited another hour before cautiously approaching the crevice entrance. Stay here, he told Leah. I'll check if it's gone. Drawing his knife, Jonas squeezed back through the narrow opening. The twilight landscape was empty of immediate threats, but the Sandcat's tracks were clear in the dusty ground. It had finally moved on, but would likely return. These predators were territorial and had excellent memories. Clear, he called back to Leah. But we move fast. They made it back to the cave without further incident, but Jonas knew the Sandcat would now associate them with this area. They would need to be more careful in their movements, perhaps even relocate if the predator became too persistent. As the days passed, they developed a rudimentary form of communication, a mixture of gestures, drawings scratched in dirt, and a growing vocabulary of shared words. Jonas learned that she was indeed a Dari, taken from her family during a raid on their caravan. She had been a slave to the Dravari for almost a full cycle of the larger moon, about 3 Earth months by Jonas's reckoning. And he learned something else. The Adari were nomadic by necessity, not choice. Their ancestral homelands in the desert had been seized by another tribe, the warlike Ket, generations ago. The Adari now wandered the fringes of the desert, struggling to survive. Family, Leah said one evening, pointing to the distant southern horizon where the edge of the great desert began. Leah, go family. Jonas felt a strange twist in his chest. Of course she wanted to return to her people. What had he expected? That she would stay with him in this cave, 2 castaways from different worlds? Dangerous, V said, one of the words she had learned. He pointed to the desert. Very dangerous. Leah nodded solemnly. Danger, yes, but family. Her violet eyes held his, unwavering. That night, as Leah slept, Jonas sat at the mouth of the cave, staring at the twin moons. The desert was a death trap, scorching by day, freezing by night, with scarce water and predators that made the 6-legged wolves seem tame by comparison. Few who entered ever returned, but he knew what it was to be the last of your kind, to be alone in a world that had taken everything from you. Could he deny her the chance to rejoin her people when he would give anything to see another human face? By morning, his decision was made. They would leave in 2 days after preparations were complete. The journey would take them through the worst of the Badlands and into the desert beyond. Jonas spent the next day hunting, preserving meat, and collecting water. He fashioned a small bow for Leah and began teaching her to use it. Her aim was poor, but her determination made up for it. She would need to defend herself when they parted ways. On the morning of their departure, Jonas stood at the entrance of the cave that had been his home for 20 years. Everything he needed was packed into a leather satchel or strapped to his body. His bow and a quiver of arrows hung from his shoulder. A spear, useful for both hunting and defense, served as a walking staff. Leah waited outside, practically vibrating with excitement despite the dangers ahead. She wore a tunic Jonas had fashioned from the hide of a blue wolf, cinched at the waist with a rope belt that held a small knife, her first weapon. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded, pointing south. Family. With one last look at the cave, Jonas turned his back on the only safety he had known for 2 decades and began walking toward the unknown. As they descended from the highlands where Jonas's cave was located, the landscape gradually changed. The rocky terrain gave way to scrubland, where twisted vegetation fought for survival in the thin soil. Game became more plentiful here, smaller creatures that darted through the undergrowth, providing opportunities for Leah to practice her hunting skills. By midday, they had reached a narrow river, one of the few reliable water sources in the region. Jonas filled their water skins while Leah marveled at the small, translucent fish that darted beneath the surface. "Can eat?" she asked, pointing at the fish. Jonas nodded. "Yes, but tricky to catch." He demonstrated by fashioning a simple spear from a straight branch, sharpening one end with his knife. With practiced patience, he stood motionless at the water's edge, spear poised. When a larger fish swam near, he struck with lightning speed, impaling it neatly. Leah clapped her hands in delight, then demanded to try herself. Her first attempts were clumsy, splashing water and scaring the fish away. But by the third try, she managed to spear a small one, her face lighting up with triumph. "Good," Jonas praised, genuinely impressed by her quick learning. "Very good." They cooked the fish over a small fire, eating quickly before continuing their journey. As they walked, Jonas maintained a constant vigilance, aware that they were more exposed here than in the Badlands. The scrubland offered hiding places for ambush predators and for the tribal hunters who sometimes ventured this far north. Late in the afternoon, they came across an unusual sight, a stand of tall, slender trees with phosphorescent blue leaves that swayed despite the still air. Jonas had seen these before, but rarely this close to the Badlands. "What those?" Leah asked, reaching out to touch one of the glowing leaves. Jonas caught her hand. "Careful, spirit trees, carnivorous." As if in response to his words, the branches of the nearest tree bent downward, reaching towards them with eerie purpose. Jonas pulled Leah back just as a shower of tiny darts, actually specialized leaves, shot from the branches, embedding themselves in the ground where they had been standing. The darts paralyze," he explained as they backed away. "The roots come up at night to take what can't move." Leah's eyes widened. "Trees eat people?" "Trees eat anything they can catch," Jonas corrected. "This world isn't like yours or mine. Everything here evolved to survive." They gave the spirit trees a wide berth, making camp that night on a rocky outcrop where no roots could reach them. As they ate dried meat from Jonas's pack, Leah asked questions about the trees, the fish, the strange world they traveled through. Her curiosity seemed boundless, and Jonas found himself recalling knowledge his mother had taught him. The biology of this alien ecosystem, the adaptations that made life possible in such harsh conditions. "Your mother was wise," Leah said when he explained how the spirit trees use parasites to share nutrients between them. "She was a scientist," Jonas replied, "a botanist. She studied plants. She wanted to understand this world, not just survive in it." "Like you," Leah observed, "you understand. That's why you still live when others die." The simple insight startled Jonas. He had never thought of himself as continuing his mother's work, but in a way he had. His survival depended on the knowledge she had accumulated and passed on, the properties of plants, the behavior of animals, the rhythms of this alien world. Before he could respond, a distant howl broke the night's stillness, the hunting call of a blue wolf. Then another answered, and another, a pack moving in their direction. "We need to move," Jonas said, already gathering their supplies. "They've caught our scent." They descended from the outcrop quickly, moving perpendicular to the wolves' approach. In the darkness, with only the moons and glowing vegetation for light, the journey became treacherous. Twice Leah stumbled, and once Jonas narrowly avoided stepping into a spine pit, a natural trap where needle-sharp rock formations waited to impale the unwary. The howls grew closer despite their efforts. The wolves were faster, designed by evolution for this landscape in ways humans, and even Adari, were not. There, Jonas pointed to a massive fallen tree, its trunk hollow with age. Inside. They squeezed into the hollow trunk just as the first of the wolves appeared, its blue fur silver in the moonlight. Others followed. Jonas counted 6 in total, a large pack. They circled the fallen tree, growling low in their throats. "They know we're here," he whispered to Leah, who pressed against him in the confined space. "But they're cautious. The log smells of rot, masks our scent somewhat." One wolf, larger than the others, the alpha, approached the trunk opening, sniffing cautiously. Jonas gripped his spear, ready to strike if it ventured too close. Leah, to her credit, remained perfectly still, her breathing controlled despite her fear. The alpha wolf was just beginning to withdraw when a sudden wind shift carried their scent directly to the pack. The reaction was immediate. Snarls, scratching at the log, attempts to force their way inside. "Back," Jonas ordered, pushing further into the hollow trunk. "There might be another opening." They crawled through the rotting interior, ignoring the insects and small creatures that scattered at their approach. The wolves' snarls echoed behind them, punctuated by the sound of claws scrabbling against wood. The trunk narrowed as they progressed, threatening to trap them, but finally opened into a small cavity where the tree had split during its fall. A narrow opening led to the outside, just large enough for them to squeeze through. Jonas went first, ensuring the area was clear before helping Leah out. They emerged on the opposite side of a small ravine, temporarily hidden from the wolves. But it wouldn't take the predators long to circle around. "We climb," Jonas decided, pointing to the ravine wall. The rocky surface offered handholds, and at the top was another spirit tree grove, dangerous, but the wolves would avoid the trees just as carefully as humans did. The climb was difficult, especially for Leah with her smaller reach. Jonas went slightly ahead, finding secure holds and guiding her hands to them. Behind them, the first wolves appeared at the mouth of the hollow log, picking up their trail. "Hurry," Jonas urged, as Leah struggled with a particularly difficult stretch. He reached down, grasped her wrist, and pulled her up just as a wolf leaped at the ravine wall, jaws snapping inches from her foot. They reached the top, exhausted but safe for the moment. The spirit trees created a natural barrier, their phosphorescent leaves casting an eerie blue glow over the landscape. The wolves paced at the edge of the grove, unwilling to venture closer to the carnivorous plants. "We rest here," Jonas decided. "The wolves will eventually move on to easier prey." They made a small camp in a clearing among the trees, careful to stay away from the reach of the branches. Despite the danger of their position, both were asleep within minutes, the day's exertions taking their toll. Jonas woke first, alerted by some subtle change in their surroundings. The wolves were gone, but something else had disturbed his hunter's senses. He scanned the spirit tree grove, now less luminescent in the early morning light. There, a figure moving between the trees, not animal but humanoid, and another behind it. Tribal hunters, by their silent movements and camouflage clothing. He shook Leah awake gently, covering her mouth to prevent any sound of surprise. When her eyes opened, he put a finger to his lips, then pointed to the approaching figures. "Dravari," she whispered, her body tensing with fear. Jonas shook his head. These weren't the blue-skinned Dravari. The glimpses he caught showed rust-colored skin and elaborate scarification. "Ket," he murmured, "desert warriors." The Ket were moving systematically through the grove, tracking something. Tracking them, Jonas realized. They must have picked up their trail from the ravine. "We need to move," he whispered, quietly, between the trees where the ground is clear of leaves. They gathered their few possessions silently and began to edge away from the approaching hunters. The spirit trees provided some cover, but also limited their movement. Step too close, and they'd trigger a dart shower that would alert the Ket instantly. They had almost reached the edge of the grove when one of the hunters gave a shout. They had been spotted. "Run!" Jonas ordered, abandoning stealth for speed. They burst from the grove, sprinting across open ground toward a line of rocky outcroppings in the distance. Behind them, the Ket pursued, their longer legs eating up the distance. Jonas glanced back, assessing. 3 hunters, all armed with long, curved blades and what looked like throwing spears. They would overtake them before they reached the rocks. "Keep going," he told Leah. I'll hold them off. No, she protested. But Jonas had already stopped, turning to face the approaching hunters. He knocked an arrow in the bone bow he'd taken from the Dravari camp, drew, and fired in one smooth motion. The arrow struck the lead hunter in the thigh, staggering him. The others slowed, reassessing this prey that fought back unexpectedly. Jonas used the moment to fire again, this time aiming to miss, but forcing them to scatter. Go, he shouted to Leah, who stood frozen several paces away. Something in his voice must have reached her, for she turned and ran toward the rocks. The Ket regrouped quickly. One stayed with the wounded hunter, but the third, clearly the most experienced, continued the pursuit. Jonas fired again, but the hunter dodged with surprising agility, closing the distance rapidly. There was no time for another arrow. Jonas dropped the bow and drew his hunting knife, facing the approaching warrior. The Ket slowed, sizing up this strange creature that stood its ground. He said something in his harsh language, gesturing with his blade. Jonas didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear enough. Surrender and you might live. He responded by adjusting his grip on the knife, legs set in a fighting stance. The Ket attacked with blinding speed, his curved blade whistling through the air. Jonas ducked under the swing, feeling it pass inches from his head, and countered with a slash to the warrior's midsection. But the Ket was faster than any human opponent, twisting away from the blade and kicking Jonas hard in the chest. The blow sent him sprawling backward, breath knocked from his lungs. The Ket advanced, weapon raised for a killing stroke. Jonas rolled aside just in time, the blade striking sparks from the rocky ground where he had been. Getting to his feet, Jonas circled warily. The Ket was stronger and faster, but Jonas had one advantage: decades of fighting for survival against creatures far deadlier than any humanoid. He had learned to read body language, to anticipate movement, to strike with precision rather than power. When the Ket attacked again, Jonas was ready. Instead of dodging, he stepped into the attack, accepting a glancing blow to his shoulder to get inside the warrior's guard. His knife found the gap between the Ket's armored vest and belt, sinking deep into flesh. The warrior roared in pain, staggering back. Jonas pressed his advantage, striking again, this time at the exposed neck. But the Ket recovered faster than expected, catching Jonas's wrist in an iron grip. They grappled, each seeking leverage, until both fell to the ground in a tangle of limbs. The fight became a desperate struggle, all technique forgotten as they rolled across the rocky terrain. The Ket's superior strength was telling. He pinned Jonas to the ground, one hand forcing the human's knife arm down, while the other reached for a small blade at his belt. Jonas bucked and twisted, but couldn't break free. The Ket raised the blade, triumph in his eyes, and then jerked violently as something struck him from behind. The pressure on Jonas's arm eased as the warrior toppled sideways, revealing a small arrow protruding from his back. Not a killing shot, but enough to disable. Leah stood 20 paces away, the small ball Jonas had made for her still raised. Her face was a mask of determination and fear. Come, she shouted. More coming! Jonas scrambled to his feet, retrieving his knife. The other two Ket were indeed approaching, the wounded one limping, but still dangerous. He grabbed the fallen warrior's curved blade, a superior weapon to his hunting knife, and ran to join Leah. Together they sprinted for the rocky outcroppings, reaching them just ahead of their pursuers. The formation was a natural maze of narrow passages and dead ends, but Leah moved through it with surprising confidence, leading them deeper into the labyrinth. You know this place? Jonas asked between breaths. Adari stories, she replied. Sacred stones. Bad spirits keep Ket away. Whether it was bad spirits or simply the defensive advantage of the narrow passages, the Ket did indeed halt their pursuit at the entrance to the maze. Jonas could hear them calling to each other, their voices echoing strangely off the stone walls. Leah led them to a small chamber at the heart of the formation, where an opening in the ceiling admitted light and air. Ancient symbols were carved into the rock walls, pictographs of hunts, migrations, battles. Adari place, Leah explained, touching one of the carvings reverently. Old ones come here to speak with ancestors. Will the Ket follow us? Jonas asked, binding his injured shoulder with a strip torn from his tunic. Leah shook her head. Not here. Sacred place. Even enemies respect. Jonas wasn't entirely convinced, but they needed rest, and this was as safe as they were likely to find. He set his new blade within easy reach and checked their supplies. The chase had cost them time and energy, but they still had water and dried meat enough for several days. As night fell, they ate sparingly and took turns keeping watch. The ancient chamber felt charged with a strange energy, perhaps just the weight of history, or perhaps something more, some residue of the reverence that had been paid here over generations. In the deepest part of the night, when both moons had set and only starlight filtered through the ceiling opening, Leah spoke softly. "Jonas not need help, Leah," she said. "Could leave. Safer alone." Jonas considered this. She was right. He would have better odds of survival on his own. The practical choice, the survivor's choice, would be to leave her at this Adari sacred place and return to his cave. "We go together," he said finally, "to your family." Leah smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed her face. In that moment, Jonas realized how much she had changed from the frightened, sick child he had found. There was a resilience to her now, a quiet confidence born of surviving alongside him. "Sleep," he told her. "I'll watch first." By morning, there was no sign of the kid. They had either given up the chase or were waiting in ambush somewhere ahead. Either way, staying in the sacred stones wasn't an option. They needed to continue toward the desert, toward Leah's people. They emerged cautiously from the rock formation, scanning the landscape for threats. The terrain ahead was increasingly barren, the transition zone between the scrublands and the true desert. Vegetation became sparser, the soil sandier. In the distance, the first true dunes were visible, golden waves against the horizon. "How far to the desert?" Leah asked, shielding her eyes from the rising suns. "Half a day's walk," Jonas estimated. "But finding your people in the desert, that will be the challenge." Leah pointed to a distant smudge on the horizon. "Smoke, maybe a Dari camp." Jonas squinted against the glare. It could be smoke from campfires, but it could also be a dust devil or a mirage. Still, it was a direction to aim for. They set off at a steady pace, conserving energy for the long trek ahead. The day grew hotter as they walked, the twin suns beating down mercilessly. Jonas fashioned head coverings from their spare clothing, protecting them from the worst of the heat. By midday, the transition to desert was complete. Sand shifted beneath their feet with each step, making progress slower and more exhausting. There was no shelter from the suns, no respite from the heat. They rationed their water carefully, taking small sips at regular intervals. The smoke Leah had spotted seemed no closer despite hours of walking. Jonas began to suspect it was indeed a mirage, a trick of the heat and light. But they had committed to this direction, and changing course now would only waste precious energy. As the day wore on, Jonas noticed Leah beginning to flag. Her steps became uneven, her breathing labored. The desert heat was taking a greater toll on her smaller body. "We rest," he decided, looking for any semblance of shade. There was none, just endless sand in all directions. Improvising, Jonas planted his spear upright in the sand and draped his cloak over it, creating a small patch of shade. They huddled beneath it, sharing a few precious sips of water. "Not far now," Leah said, though it was clear she had no more idea than he did how much further they needed to travel. Jonas studied the horizon. The smoke they had been following was gone, if it had ever been there at all, but something else caught his eye, a darkness on the edge of the sky to the south. "Storm," he said grimly. "Sandstorm. Coming this way." Leah followed his gaze, her expression turning fearful. "What we do?" Jonas had heard of the desert storms but never experienced one. They were said to strip flesh from bone, to bury entire caravans under mountains of sand. Without shelter, their chances were slim. He scanned the terrain desperately. Nothing but sand in all directions. Wait. There, perhaps a mile distant, a darker patch against the golden landscape. Rocks, or perhaps the remnants of an ancient structure. "There," he pointed. "We run." They abandoned their makeshift shade, gathering their supplies in seconds. The storm was approaching visibly now, a towering wall of darkness that devoured the horizon. They ran, feet slipping and sliding in the loose sand, driven by the primal fear of the approaching maelstrom. The dark patch resolved into a cluster of massive boulders, wind carved into fantastic shapes over millennia. Between two of the largest was a narrow crevice, just wide enough for them to squeeze through. "In there!" Jonas shouted over the rising wind. The storm was almost upon them, the air already thick with swirling sand. They reached the crevice just as the full force of the storm hit. The world disappeared in a howling fury of sand and wind, visibility reduced to inches. Jonas pushed Leah ahead of him into the narrow space, following close behind. The passage twisted sharply, then opened into a small cavity within the boulder formation, a natural shelter, protected from the direct force of the storm. "Cover your face," Jonas instructed, pulling his own head covering across his nose and mouth. "Don't breathe the sand." They huddled together as the storm raged outside, the sound of sand striking stone like a million tiny whips. Fine particles found their way into the shelter despite its protection, coating everything with a layer of grit. They pulled their cloaks over their heads, creating a tent within the cave to shield themselves from the worst of it. Hours passed, the storm showing no sign of abating. In the close confines of their shelter, with nothing to do but wait, Jonas found himself telling Leah about Earth, about the green forests and blue oceans of the world he had never seen except in the fading photographs his parents had brought to this planet. "Trees on Earth not eat people?" Leah asked, incredulous. "No," Jonas smiled. "They just grow and make oxygen. Animals eat their fruits or leaves, but the trees themselves don't hunt." "Sounds boring," Leah decided, making Jonas laugh, a rusty sound he barely recognized as his own. Eventually, lulled by the constant sound of the storm and exhausted from their day's journey, they both drifted into sleep, still huddled together beneath their makeshift tent. Jonas woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie quiet in its wake. Cautiously, he made his way to the crevice entrance, now partially blocked by drifted sand. He dug his way out, emerging into a transformed landscape. The desert had been reshaped by the storm. New dunes formed where none had been before. The twin suns, now low in the sky, cast long shadows across the rippled sand. It was beautiful in its stark, alien way. Leah joined him, her eyes widening at the changed terrain. "Which way now?" she asked. Jonas checked the position of the suns, getting his bearings. "Still south," he said, "but we wait until morning. Too easy to get lost at night." They made camp in the shelter of the boulders, rationing their dwindling supplies. Water was becoming a critical concern. If they didn't find an oasis or a well soon, they would have to turn back, and even that might not save them. As night fell, bringing a bone-deep chill to the air that contrasted sharply with the day's heat, they kept watch for the lights of distant campfires, any sign of the Atri or other desert dwellers. The darkness was complete, the stars overwhelmingly bright in the clear desert air. "Look," Leah said suddenly, pointing to the southern horizon. "Lights." Jonas strained his eyes. There, just visible against the darkness, were tiny points of light, too steady for stars, too numerous for coincidence. Campfires, a settlement or a caravan of some kind. "Could be your people," he acknowledged. "Could also be Ket or others." "We go see?" Leah asked, hope evident in her voice. Jonas considered. Their water would last another day at most. The lights represented their best chance of survival, regardless of who made them. At first light, he decided, too dangerous to travel now. They spent a restless night, both too aware of what morning might bring, either salvation or new dangers. When the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, they were already packed and ready to move. The lights they had seen were gone, extinguished with the sunrise. But Jonas had marked their position carefully. They set off across the desert, the sand cool beneath their feet in the early morning air. Each step was an effort, their bodies weakened by thirst and the previous day's exertion. By mid-morning, they had crossed several dune ridges, each offering a view of more desert beyond. But after cresting a particularly tall dune, they saw something different, a depression in the desert floor, and within it, a cluster of structures. Not permanent buildings, but rather large tent-like dwellings, arranged in a circle around what appeared to be a well. Leah gasped, clutching Jonas's arm. "Adari tents," she whispered, voice trembling with emotion. "My people." Jonas studied the encampment through narrowed eyes. The tents matched Leah's description of Adari dwellings, made from a material that shifted colors with the changing light, currently a pale lavender in the morning sun. Movement was visible between the structures, figures with the same blue skin as Leah going about their daily tasks. Could be a trap, he cautioned. The Ket know we're heading this way. They could have captured an Adari camp. Leah shook her head firmly. Not Ket way. They kill, not pretend. She pointed to a banner flying from the central tent, bearing a symbol of intertwined circles. That my family sign, Nerith clan. Jonas couldn't argue with her certainty. Still, caution was ingrained in him after decades of survival. I go first, he decided. Stay hidden until I signal it's safe. Leah started to protest, but Jonas cut her off. If it's truly your people, they'll welcome you regardless. But if it's a trap, at least one of us needs to remain free. Reluctantly, she agreed to his plan. They descended the dune together, finding a smaller ridge within sight of the camp where Leah could wait in relative safety. Jonas checked his weapons. The curved Ket blade, now his primary weapon, plus his hunting knife and a few throwing sticks he had fashioned during their journey. Wait for my signal, he reminded Leah. 3 arm waves means it's safe. Anything else, run and hide. She nodded solemnly, her violet eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. On impulse, Jonas reached out and squeezed her shoulder gently, a gesture of reassurance that felt foreign to his long, isolated existence. Then he turned and walked openly toward the Adari camp, his weapons visible but not drawn. Better to appear confident than skulking. If this was indeed a peaceful encounter, stealth would only create suspicion. His approach was noticed almost immediately. Activity in the camp ceased, figures turning to watch the strange being walking out of the desert. Several Adari males moved to the perimeter, carrying spears and bows, simple weapons, but effective in the right hands. Jonas stopped a respectful distance away, hands held slightly away from his sides to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. One of the Adari males stepped forward, a spear held not quite threateningly, but ready. He spoke, the musical language incomprehensible to Jonas. I don't understand, Jonas said, knowing his words were equally meaningless to the Adari. He tried gestures instead, pointing to himself, then to the desert behind him, then making a cradling motion with his arms, trying to indicate a child. The Adari looked confused, conferring with his companions. Then a female pushed through the group, older, with elaborate markings on her face and arms that suggested authority. She studied Jonas intently, then asked a question, making the same cradling gesture he had used. Jonas nodded emphatically. Yes, he said, pointing again to the desert. A child, Leah. He used the name he had given her, unsure if it would mean anything to them. The female's expression changed, a mix of disbelief and desperate hope crossing her features. She called out, a name that sounded like Ashara, with additional syllables Jonas couldn't catch. The name Leah had first given him, before he shortened it. Taking a chance, Jonas turned and gave the signal, 3 clear waves of his arm. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a small figure appeared at the top of the dune ridge, hesitant at first, then running full tilt toward the camp. Nerith, Leah shouted, her voice carrying across the desert. Mother! The female Adari, Nerith apparently, ran forward to meet her, both of them colliding in an embrace of desperate joy. Others followed, surrounding them, voices raised in what could only be celebration. Jonas watched from where he stood, suddenly forgotten in the emotional reunion. It was several minutes before Leah remembered him. She broke free from the group and ran back, taking his hand and pulling him toward the gathered Adari. They watched his approach with expressions ranging from curiosity to wariness to gratitude. Leah spoke rapidly in her native language, pointing to Jonas, then to her own neck, where the marks of the wasting sickness had faded to faint discolorations. She mimed his actions, cutting her free, carrying her, treating her illness, teaching her to hunt. The Adari listened intently, their expressions softening as the story unfolded. When she finished, Nerith stepped forward and placed both hands on Jonas's shoulders, a gesture of acceptance that needed no translation. She spoke, her voice rich with emotion, looking directly into his eyes. She says, Leah translated, that you have returned her heart to her body, that no payment could be enough, but all she has is yours. Jonas nodded awkwardly, uncomfortable with gratitude after so many years of isolation. Tell her I did what anyone would do, he said. Leah tilted her head, that now familiar gesture of consideration. Not true, she said simply, before translating his words more diplomatically. The Adari welcomed him into their camp, offering water, precious beyond measure in the desert, and food unlike anything Jonas had tasted in decades. Flavored with unfamiliar spices, it reminded him how bland his solitary diet had been. As the day progressed, more Adari approached him, some touching his strange skin or hair with cautious fingers, others bringing small gifts, woven bracelets, carved bone tokens, dried desert flowers. Through Leah's increasingly fluent translations, Jonas learned that this group was indeed her clan, the Nerith, named for her mother who led them. They were returning from a trading journey to the eastern settlements, heading back to their temporary territory on the desert's western edge. The storm had delayed them, leading to the coincidence that had placed them directly in Jonas and Leah's path. As night fell, the camp gathered around a central fire. Jonas sat slightly apart, observing. The reunion was joyous. It seemed Leah was the daughter of someone important in the tribe. Her return was being celebrated with song and storytelling. The older female who had first embraced Leah approached Jonas, sitting cross-legged beside him. She spoke slowly, gesturing between herself and Leah. Mother, Jonas guessed. You're her mother. The woman smiled, touching her chest. Nerith, she said. Then she touched his chest, eyebrows raised in question. Jonas, he replied. Jonas, she repeated, then placed her hand over her heart and bowed her head slightly. The gesture needed no translation. Gratitude was universal. Leah joined them, settling between Jonas and her mother. Nerith say thank you, she translated unnecessarily. For save Leah. Jonas nodded awkwardly, unused to gratitude. You would have survived without me, he said. You're strong. Leah translated for her mother, who listened intently. Nerith responded with a long speech, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. Mother say, Leah began, desert take strong ones too. Take unwary. Take unprepared. She paused as Nerith continued. Say you brave. Say you honorable. As the celebration continued late into the night, Jonas found himself the center of attention when an elderly Adari male, introduced as the clan's storyteller, asked through Leah to hear the tale of the last human. Reluctantly at first, then with growing confidence, Jonas recounted the history of the failed expedition, the years of solitude, and finally his journey with Leah. The Adari listened with rapt attention, especially the children, who seemed fascinated by this strange being from beyond the desert. When he described his fights with the Sandcat and the Ket warriors, there were exclamations of approval and impressed murmurs. They think you great warrior, Leah whispered, like hero from old stories. Eventually, Jonas was shown to a tent where he could rest. The bedding was soft, made from woven fibers he didn't recognize, and far more comfortable than anything he'd had in years. Despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him. His mind kept returning to the journey ahead, his journey alone back to his cave. The thought brought no comfort. For the first time in decades, the prospect of solitude felt not like safety, but like emptiness. Morning came too soon. Jonas emerged from the tent to find the camp already busy with activity. The Adari were nomads. They never stayed in one place for long. Already some of the tents were being dismantled, packed onto the backs of large, six-legged creatures that resembled camels, but had scaled, iridescent skin. Leah found him as he was checking his own pack, preparing for the return journey. She watched him silently for a moment. You leave? She finally asked, her voice small. Jonas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Why? The simple question held worlds of confusion. Stay with Adari, with Leah. Jonas sighed, setting down his pack. I can't, Leah. I don't belong here. Belong where? Alone in cave? Her violet eyes flashed with sudden anger. That not living. That's surviving. Before he could respond, Nerith approached, accompanied by the elderly storyteller, whose elaborate garments marked him as someone of importance. The old one spoke, his voice deep and resonant, while Nerith translated into the broken mixture of English and Adari that Jonas and Leah had developed. Elder Korith welcomed Jonas to Adari. she said carefully. Say man who saved child of tribe is friend of tribe. The elder continued, gesturing toward the assembled Adari, then to the desert beyond. Say Adari journey now to summer grounds, cross great desert, dangerous path, many predators. Nereth's eyes met Jonas's. Say Adari needs strong hunters, need brave hearts. Jonas understood what was being offered, a place among them, not as an outsider, but as a member of the tribe, a family of sorts. He began, then stopped. What was there to go back to? A cave filled with the echoes of his solitude? I'm not Adari, he finally said. I'm human. The last human. Leah tugged at his hand, demanding his attention. Last Adari too, she said, pointing to a group of children playing nearby. There were perhaps 5 or 6, of varying ages. Ket kill many, take many, Adari few now. Her eyes held his, challenging. Last ones stay together, stronger. Jonas looked from Leah to Nereth, to the elder whose weathered face showed nothing but calm acceptance. These people, who had every reason to fear or reject him, a strange being from another world, were offering him a home. Jonas took a deep breath. I will stay, he said, the words feeling right as they left his mouth. I will hunt for the Adari, fight for the Adari. He looked at Leah, whose face was lighting up with joy. Teach the young ones to survive. Nereth translated, and a murmur went through the gathered tribe. The elder nodded solemnly, then stepped forward and placed both hands on Jonas's shoulders, a gesture of acceptance. Leah threw her arms around Jonas's waist, nearly knocking him over with the force of her embrace. Family now, she said fiercely. Jonas family. The caravan departed as the larger sun reached its zenith, moving deeper into the desert. Jonas walked beside one of the scaled beasts of burden, helping to guide it over the difficult terrain. Ahead, Leah rode with her mother, occasionally looking back to ensure he was still there. Each time Jonas raised a hand in reassurance. Yes, he was still here. Yes, he would remain. The last human had found his place in this alien world. Not as a relic of a failed expedition, but as a guardian, a protector, a part of something larger than himself. As the days passed and the desert stretched before them, Jonas found himself watching the horizon not with the wariness of a survivor, but with the anticipation of someone on a journey home.